The sky over Miami International shimmered in a perfect blue, the kind that seemed to promise a smooth journey ahead. Inside Terminal D, among the luxury boutiques and rushing passengers, the air buzzed with the usual mix of anticipation and exhaustion. But for one traveler, Serena Miles, the day was anything but ordinary. Dressed in a simple, fitted gray suit and carrying a black leather satchel, Serena walked through the terminal like any other first-class traveler. Polished, composed, and seemingly in no hurry, she paused only once, at a newsstand where she picked up a bottle of water and politely declined the cashier's small talk. Her eyes, however, never stopped moving. They flicked between gate monitors, fellow passengers, and the crew at the gate. To an untrained observer, she looked like a businesswoman catching another routine flight. But beneath her calm exterior was something no one around her could have guessed. Serena was not who she appeared to be. And in less than 6 hours, her identity would send shockwaves through the aviation industry, upend lives, and ignite a firestorm across the internet. She was an undercover CIA operative on active assignment. But that truth remained hidden as she boarded the flight. Just another passenger, one seat in the elegant world of first class, where smiles were polished and prejudice dressed itself in politeness. Flight 419 to San Francisco began boarding with little fanfare. A warm voice crackled through the gate speakers, calling passengers by group number. As Serena approached the gate, the flight attendant checking tickets barely looked at her face. Her tone was cool, the greeting perfunctory. "First class to the left," she said, her eyes lingering for a beat longer than necessary on Serena's skin, before turning away with an indifferent nod. Serena didn't flinch. She never did. Years of training had taught her how to sense the subtle shifts in tone, the microaggressions people thought went unnoticed. She had seen racism across the globe, in boardrooms, border crossings, and battlefields. But there was something particularly sharp when it showed up in places that promised professionalism. A plane was a contained world, and this one had already whispered where it stood. In seat 2A, Serena settled in, her movements smooth and deliberate. She placed her satchel beneath the seat and tapped briefly on her phone, logging encrypted notes through what looked like a harmless travel app. Her mission? To observe and identify irregular patterns in flight crew behavior, specifically those suspected of aiding in a cross-country drug transport ring operating under the cover of routine air travel. What she hadn't expected was that she would become the center of the storm. A few rows back, flight attendant Brittany Lang was making final checks. At 34, Brittany was the kind of woman who could make anyone feel small without ever raising her voice. Her uniform was perfect, her blonde hair pulled into a tight bun that never moved out of place. From the outside, she was the model of airline grace. But just beneath that polished veneer lived a bitterness that had grown like a quiet infection over the years. Brittany had watched the airline change, watched newer, younger, more diverse hires be promoted faster, watched old friends get replaced by people who looked better on the company brochure. She smiled through it all, until she didn't, until resentment took root, and until she started cutting corners, accepting favors, and aligning herself with a lucrative side hustle that promised quick cash if she kept her eyes closed and her access open. So when she saw Serena sitting in first class, alone, composed, and visibly black, something flared behind her eyes. Not fear, not curiosity, but that twisted reflex of assumption, of deciding someone's story before they ever speak. She greeted the elderly white couple in 1A and 1B with warmth, the young businessman in 2C with flirtatious charm. But when she reached Serena's seat, the smile vanished. "Anything to drink?" she asked, flatly. Serena met her gaze, calm and unwavering. "Just sparkling water, please." There was no ma'am, no warmth, no welcome. Brittany walked away. Serena didn't react. She simply noted it, like she'd noted the last-minute gate change, the mismatched security credentials on a ramp agent, and the coded language exchanged between two other flight attendants near the galley. Patterns, signs. She was trained to spot them, and everything about this flight, especially Brittany Lang, was beginning to raise a different kind of red flag. The cabin doors closed. The aircraft pushed back. A voice welcomed passengers over the intercom, and somewhere above the Florida coastline, at 35,000 feet, the game began. But no one, not the passengers recording their meals for Instagram, not the crew chatting softly in the galley, had any idea of the chain reaction that was about to unfold. They didn't know that one crew member was carrying a hidden package worth over $50,000. They didn't know that a criminal network had begun using first class as a covert delivery system. And they certainly didn't know that the woman in seat 2A wasn't just another passenger. She was their biggest threat, their undoing, their reckoning. As the plane leveled out and drinks were poured, Brittany glanced back toward Serena's seat, her smile fake, her plan beginning to form. She had no idea what she was up against. And Serena, she was ready. Because beneath the quiet, beneath the smooth service and scripted smiles, there was a storm brewing at 35,000 feet. And someone was about to make the worst mistake of their life. Joan. The hum of the engines was steady, and the sky outside the cabin windows glowed in soft streaks of sunset gold. For most passengers on Flight 419, the journey was uneventful. A few glasses of wine, a nap, a movie or two. But beneath the polished veneer of comfort, something far more sinister was unraveling in the aisles of first class. Serena Miles sat upright, tablet in hand, her eyes fixed on the screen, but her mind racing. The quiet interaction she'd observed, the glances, the whispers, the odd tension between crew members, were forming a pattern too deliberate to ignore. This wasn't just poor service or the occasional lapse in professionalism. Something was being moved on this flight, and the person facilitating it was the same woman who had refused to offer her a blanket an hour earlier. Brittany Lang had begun pacing more frequently. She stopped by the galley, lingered near her crew bag longer than usual, her eyes scanning the cabin each time she returned. Her movements were too rehearsed to be casual. Serena, years into her CIA career, had tracked war criminals through Eastern Europe and infiltrated cartels in South America. She knew what a guilty conscience looked like when it tried to wear a smile. But even with all her training, she didn't expect what came next. Brittany's decision wasn't driven by strategy. It was panic. Somewhere between the guilt and greed, the flight attendant had convinced herself that Serena was watching too closely, that this poised black woman in seat 2A wasn't just a passenger, and she was right. But rather than backing down, Brittany decided to strike first. She waited until Serena got up for a bathroom break. In a blur of quiet urgency, Brittany approached 2A. With swift, practiced hands, she reached into her apron pocket and pulled out a small, vacuum-sealed pouch, no larger than a deck of cards. She glanced over her shoulder, then leaned toward the handbag resting beside Serena's seat. In one motion, she lifted the flap and slid the pouch inside, pressing it deep between the lining and the side pocket. It took less than 5 seconds. When Serena returned, she caught a glimpse of Brittany walking away. The overly saccharine smile, the sudden interest in offering her a fresh glass of sparkling water. The shift was subtle, but Serena felt it instantly. Something had changed. She sat slowly, her body instinctively more alert. Her gaze swept the cabin. She opened her handbag discreetly, her fingers brushing the interior until they paused. There it was, something that wasn't hers. She didn't need to pull it out. Not yet. She knew what this was. Not just a setup, but a weapon. And in this moment, she became more than an undercover agent on a classified mission. She became a target. 10 minutes later, Brittany made her move. She walked briskly to the intercom phone near the galley and made a call to the cockpit. Her voice was urgent, rehearsed. "Captain, we may have a passenger carrying contraband. She's in first class, seat 2, A." The captain followed protocol. An air marshal, seated in plain clothes near the emergency exit, was informed. Within minutes, Brittany and the marshal were walking down the aisle together. Brittany's voice rang out with performative concern. "Excuse me, ma'am," she said, loud enough for every head in first class to turn. "We need to inspect your belongings. We've received a report about a suspicious item." Serena didn't move. Her gaze remained calm, but her voice held a quiet warning. "On what grounds are you searching my bag?" Brittany gestured to the marshal. "Standard protocol when a passenger is reported for suspicious activity," she replied, her tone falsely apologetic, but eyes glittering with self-satisfaction. Serena glanced at the marshal, reading him in a heartbeat. By the book, unsure, uncomfortable, not malicious. Just another man doing his job in a system that too often failed to question bias, dressed in the uniform of authority. Without waiting for permission, Brittany reached down and retrieved Serena's bag. She unzipped it theatrically, and within seconds, pulled out the pouch. She held it high, like a trophy. "This," she said loudly, "was in her bag. This passenger has brought illegal substances onto this aircraft." The cabin fell into stunned silence. A few passengers gasped. Others raised their phones. One woman across the aisle whispered, "Unbelievable," as she began recording. And in the middle of it all, Serena sat frozen, not out of fear, but calculation. She looked at the pouch in Brittany's hand, then up at the marshal. "I've never seen that before," she said calmly. "I believe this is an attempt to frame me." Brittany scoffed. "Are you accusing a flight attendant of planting drugs?" Serena looked her straight in the eye. "Yes." The marshal hesitated. He was trained to assess threats, but nothing about Serena's demeanor matched that of a guilty person. Still, the presence of the package required immediate action. "Ma'am," he said quietly, "we'll need you to come with us to the rear of the aircraft until we land. This will be handled by airport security upon arrival." Serena stood, lifting her chin, the gaze in her eyes like steel. As she passed Brittany, she leaned in just close enough to whisper, "You just made the biggest mistake of your life." The color drained from Brittany's face, though she masked it quickly with a smirk. But inside, something wavered. As Serena walked toward the back, escorted by the marshal, phones followed her, capturing every second. The whispers behind her cut deep, not because she hadn't heard them before, but because they echoed with the same old lies. "She doesn't look surprised," one man muttered. "Knew it. First class and still up to no good," someone else said. Serena said nothing, but she didn't need to. Because what no one knew, what not even the marshal suspected, was that her bag wasn't the only thing that had been recording. Pinned discreetly to her lapel was a micro camera, and it had captured everything. The trap Brittany Lang had set was now, without knowing it, evidence in a federal investigation. The story that had just gone viral midair was not the one anyone expected. And this flight? It wasn't just carrying passengers. It was carrying the truth. What happened next would redefine justice at 35,000 feet. Joanne. The rear of the plane was cold, sterile in tone and energy. Serena Miles sat with her hands folded in her lap, her posture upright, her expression unreadable. The air marshal, seated across from her, had adopted a neutral stance, alert but not aggressive. He kept glancing at the pouch Brittany had turned over to him, now secured in a transparent evidence bag. The tension in the space was thick, but Serena wasn't panicked. She was waiting. The hum of the engines was a soft roar beneath them, but inside Serena's mind, every thought was precise. Her training taught her not to overreact, not to escalate. Her years in the CIA had prepared her for threats far deadlier than this, but rarely had the weapon been so subtle. Prejudice disguised as protocol. Back in first class, Brittany Lang basked in the false glow of validation. Passengers had praised her quick action, some applauding her diligence. A man in business attire even offered to email her commendation to the airline. She smiled modestly, but inside, a storm of arrogance was brewing. This, she believed, was her moment. What she didn't know was that she had set fire to her own future. Inside the airport, the moment the plane landed at JFK, a discreet black vehicle rolled onto the tarmac near the terminal's security entrance. It was unmarked, but the ID in the glove compartment bore the presidential seal. Two federal agents, dressed in civilian clothes, stepped out and made their way toward the gate. In the meantime, Serena was being escorted off the aircraft, not in cuffs, but flanked. The marshal, still confused by her composed demeanor, kept trying to understand why this passenger hadn't even protested. That calm was unsettling, uncommon, powerful. Inside the airport security office, Serena was offered a chair. She took it, then quietly placed her phone and the evidence bag on the desk. "I need to make a call," she said, her tone calm but carrying an unmistakable authority. The lead officer blinked. "Ma'am, we'll get to that once we—" "I recommend you make this call now," she interrupted, sliding a sleek black card across the table. No name, just a seal and a number. The officer hesitated, then picked it up and dialed. What followed was silence, then a sudden shift. The voice on the other end was commanding, clipped, and unmistakably senior. "Yes, sir. Of course, sir," the officer said into the phone. "She's here. Understood." He ended the call and stood straighter. The energy in the room shifted like a seismic wave. One by one, the other officers adjusted their stance, suddenly realizing this wasn't just a passenger with a complaint. We didn't know who you were," the lead officer murmured, his voice laced with apology. Serena stood. "You weren't supposed to, but now that you do, let me explain what you're actually involved in." She pulled a device from her handbag, a small, square-shaped transmitter. She tapped it once. The large screen on the far wall flickered to life, revealing high-resolution footage captured from the micro camera hidden in the lapel of her coat. The playback showed it all. Brittany slipping the pouch into Serena's handbag, the glance over her shoulder, the smirk, the performance, dot, dot, dot. The room fell deathly quiet. "This," Serena said, stepping forward, "is your flight attendant, Brittany Lang, committing a federal offense, planting evidence, framing a passenger, engaging in behavior designed not just to ruin a reputation, but to trigger a chain reaction of institutional violence against an innocent person. And why? Because I was the only black woman in first class." She turned to face the lead officer. "And what she didn't know is that I'm not just a passenger. I'm Serena Miles, Senior Operative, CIA. I've been running an investigation into narcotics trafficking on domestic airlines. Brittany Lang was flagged 3 months ago after an unusual number of passenger removals tied to unsubstantiated claims, each of them involving a person of color. Each time, no charges were filed. But the humiliation, the damage, it stuck." The agent at the door knocked once, then opened it. "Ma'am," he said to Serena, "we've secured the airport footage and confirmed the passenger who picked up the first drop from the lavatory. He's in holding." "Good," she nodded. "We'll cross-check him with the registry from Flight 327 and the Logan incident last spring." The lead officer looked dazed. "How deep does this go?" "That's what we're about to find out," Serena replied. Across the airport, Brittany was seated in a break room, sipping coffee like it was just another layover. She was moments away from posting a filtered selfie captioned "Hero of the Skies" when 2 plainclothes agents walked in and quietly closed the door behind them. "Brittany Lang?" one asked. "Yes?" She smiled, still riding high. "We need you to come with us." "Wait, what?" She frowned. "Is this about the passenger? I already gave my statement." "No," the agent said evenly. "This is about your role in a federal investigation into drug trafficking and false criminal reporting." Her cup hit the table. Her breath caught. "I think there's a misunderstanding." "There is." Serena's voice cut through the room as she entered. "Yours." Brittany froze, eyes wide. "What are you... how?" "I warned you," Serena said quietly. "When you decided to weaponize your prejudice, you didn't just pick the wrong woman, you picked the wrong enemy." The agents flanked Brittany, who now trembled as they read her rights. Her shoulders slumped as the reality settled over her like a tidal wave. The likes, the applause, the sense of power she'd felt, it all turned to ash. Serena stepped forward one last time. "You used bias as a weapon. Now, justice will use truth." And as Brittany Lang was escorted away, no longer the savior of the skies, but the face of a criminal case that would shake the aviation industry to its core, Serena Miles stood silently in that fluorescent-lit room. She had come on board as an observer. She was now the architect of reckoning. And the game had only just begun. Joan B.A. The news broke before Brittany Lang had even been officially processed. By the time her wrists were bound and she was walked through the security corridor at JFK under federal escort, her name had already trended across platforms. The title was stark, brutal, and impossible to ignore. Flight attendant accused of framing black passenger. Turns out she was CIA. The entire world had just landed in Brittany's worst nightmare. Inside Atlantic Sky's Manhattan headquarters, a storm had already begun to swell. Executives scrambled, phones rang endlessly, and press inquiries poured in from outlets as far as Sydney. There was no rehearsed response, no PR script smooth enough to handle this. The revelation that an employee not only planted drugs on a black first-class passenger, but had done so on a CIA operative sent to audit internal security. In the middle of this chaos, Richard Crane, the airline's CEO, stood pale and rigid as a briefing unfolded before him. On the wall behind him, looped footage showed high-definition surveillance from the aircraft. Brittany's hand slipping the package into Camille's bag, her exaggerated reaction, the smug performance that followed. And then, from Camille's own tie-pin camera, every damning detail, spoken words, movements, body language, captured with perfect clarity. "This is catastrophic," the PR director whispered, her voice cracking. "No," Crane replied, his voice steady but cold. "This is criminal." Across the country, the footage had already been picked up by national news. What had once been a viral triumph for Brittany had mutated into one of the most public corporate reckonings in recent history. Commentators didn't hold back. Headlines branded the incident as a modern-day lynching: digital, public, racial. Editorials exploded with outrage. Hashtags like "number justice for Camille" and "number flying," while black gained traction by the hour. Celebrities weighed in. Civil rights organizations launched coordinated calls for boycotts. And yet, Camille Desrosiers, the woman at the center of the maelstrom, hadn't said a single word publicly. Until now. That afternoon, Atlantic Skies announced an emergency all-staff meeting at its New York headquarters. Every employee, from flight crew to senior management, was ordered to attend either in person or virtually. The subject line of the email read simply, "Security, integrity, and the truth." When the auditorium lights dimmed and Richard Crane stepped onto the stage, the atmosphere was tense. Eyes darted, hands fidgeted. But no one expected what came next. "Today is not a celebration," Crane began. "It is a reckoning." Then he turned toward the stage entrance. "Please welcome Special Agent Camille Desrosiers." The room gasped. Cameras turned. Applause didn't follow. Instead, there was silence. Thick, breathless silence, as Camille walked calmly to the center of the stage in a dark tailored suit, her presence electric. She did not wave. She didn't smile. She simply stood. "I am here," she said softly but firmly, "because someone made the mistake of believing I didn't belong." The words hung in the air. "Because I'm a black woman in first class. Because I didn't match someone's idea of what safety looked like. Because I didn't shrink. Because I didn't smile wide enough. And because I dared to be there." Her voice sharpened. "But I was more than that. I am a federal agent, and I was investigating the very type of behavior that unraveled before your eyes. I was tracking a drug smuggling ring using commercial aircraft. But what I uncovered was something far uglier, an institutional culture that allowed bias to fester so deeply it became a weapon." The screen behind her flickered to life, playing the same footage the world had now seen, but this time in the heart of the company responsible. Brittany's smirk, her whispered remarks, her swift, cruel actions, and then the truth. The reaction in the room was visceral. Gasps, murmurs. Some turned away. Others stared at the screen, unable to look away. Camille continued. "Brittany Lang did not act alone. Maybe she planted the evidence. But how many others saw her behavior and said nothing? How many chose silence over responsibility? How many thought it was safer not to get involved?" She turned her gaze to the crowd, and it was piercing. This isn't about a single flight. This is about who we become when no one is watching. When it's easier to believe a lie than to question why someone seems out of place. I was lucky. I had training, power, and proof. But what if I didn't? What if I were just a mother, or a teacher, or a student heading home? Would you have believed her then? In the front row, several flight attendants sat with their heads bowed. Among them was Jasmine Clark, one of the few black senior crew members, her eyes full of quiet tears. Camille walked forward slowly. You have a chance now, not just to apologize, not just to issue statements, but to change. You owe it to every passenger you'll ever serve, every crew member you work alongside, and every person who has been treated as suspect simply for daring to take up space. The room stood still. No applause, just reckoning. And from that stillness, a voice rose. I'm sorry. It came from the back. A woman in a flight attendant's uniform, then another, and another. Soon the murmurs grew. We didn't know. We should have said something. We'll do better. Camille nodded once. Not in forgiveness. Not yet. But in acknowledgement. As the auditorium emptied that day, something unspoken echoed through every hallway, every break room, every whispered conversation. The truth had landed, and the entire world had seen it. What happened next would determine who chose to rise with it. The days following the public reckoning at Atlantic skies were not marked by celebration, but by rebuilding. In the quiet aftermath of global headlines and internal disruption, something deeper began to shift. Something that couldn't be measured by press coverage or stock prices. It was the beginning of a cultural reawakening inside one of the most powerful airlines in the country. And at the heart of it stood Special Agent Camille Desrosiers. While the world's eyes slowly turned to the next viral scandal, Camille remained focused on what came after the noise. Her investigation had exposed not just a smuggling ring, but the rot that comes from unchecked bias. How racism had been weaponized in a place built on service, trust, and safety. But Camille believed in something more powerful than exposure. She believed in accountability, and she believed in systems that could heal when held to the fire. Under her guidance, Atlantic Skies launched the most extensive overhaul in its 35-year history. Every employee, from top executives to the newest crew members, underwent a recertification process. Bias recognition, racial sensitivity, and intervention training were no longer optional. They were the standard. A new passenger rights office was created to independently handle complaints of discrimination, reporting directly to an external oversight board co-led by former civil rights attorneys and aviation safety experts. But the most powerful changes came in the stories shared quietly among colleagues who'd previously never spoken out. Flight attendants who once looked the other way began acknowledging what they had seen. Pilots approached Camille to thank her for the courage to say what they hadn't. For the first time, real conversations happened. Not about PR damage, but about responsibility. In the first-class lounge of the JFK terminal, Jasmine Clark, now promoted to Director of Crew Inclusivity, welcomed a new group of flight attendants. Among them sat a young black woman named Kira, fresh from training, her eyes bright with ambition. Jasmine offered a knowing smile. "This airline," she said, "used to be a place where people like us were expected to serve, not lead. But that's changing, because someone stood up when the world was watching, and more importantly, when no one was." Camille, back in D.C., continued her work quietly, declining interviews, refusing praise, But one quote from her debrief with Congress would echo across the industry. Justice isn't what happens after the damage. Justice is what prevents the damage in the first place. The skies hadn't changed, but the people flying through them had. And sometimes, that was enough to begin again. Camille Desrosiers' story began in the skies, with nothing more than a simple seat on a flight and a quiet presence that many overlooked, until they couldn't. What started as yet another moment of subtle discrimination spiraled into a dangerous, orchestrated lie when a prejudiced flight attendant decided to frame her, believing she'd get away with it. But what no one on that aircraft knew was that Camille wasn't just another black woman in first class. She was a decorated CIA agent, deep in an active investigation, trained to see what others missed and calm in the face of injustice. From the moment Camille was publicly accused of smuggling drugs, humiliated in front of fellow passengers, and led away in handcuffs, the story seemed like yet another tragic example of racial profiling. Cameras rolled, whispers spread, and judgments were cast, until Camille whispered 7 words that would turn the tables. "You have no idea what you've done." Those words were not a threat. They were a promise. What followed was a cascade of revelations. Camille's secret camera footage, her testimony, and her unwavering composure uncovered not just a corrupt flight attendant trying to cover up a drug smuggling operation, but a culture of systemic bias that allowed it to fester. Megan, the woman who believed she could exploit stereotypes to protect her criminal scheme, had made the ultimate mistake. She underestimated a woman who had spent her life outsmarting threats far more sophisticated than a plane cabin. Camille didn't just clear her name. She initiated a transformation. Through her leadership, Atlantic Skies didn't just punish the guilty. It began to dismantle the silence that allowed such prejudice to thrive. Training programs were implemented, oversight committees were established, and a new generation of aviation professionals was inspired by Camille's courage not just to serve, but to speak up. Her story wasn't about revenge. It wasn't about proving who she was. It was about shifting the lens, showing that racism doesn't always wear a hood or shout slurs. Sometimes it smiles in uniform, hides behind policies, and whispers just loud enough to destroy lives. Camille showed us that justice, when grounded in truth and dignity, can shake institutions from the inside out. The lesson we take from Camille's journey is clear. Never assume based on appearances. Never stay silent when witnessing injustice. And never underestimate the strength of someone who refuses to be defined by another's bias. In our communities, our workplaces, and our daily lives, we must remain vigilant, because real change doesn't happen from the top down, but from within. If this story moved you, if it made you think, made you feel, or reminded you of the importance of standing up for what's right, then we invite you to subscribe to this channel. Your support helps us keep telling the stories that matter, the stories that challenge and inspire, the stories that create the kind of world we all want to live in. Let's continue this journey together. Hit that subscribe button, and let's make sure stories like Camille's are never forgotten.